Interviewing Eternity. I sat uncomfortably in the overstuffed leather chair of the interview room at the magazine publisher I worked for. I nervously dabbed the sweat from my brow and refolded my handkerchief for the third time. This was supposed to be a big interview for the magazine. Some whack job claiming to have lived forever. There was a knock at the door, and I stood, smoothing out my navy blue suit, and called out, "Come on in." The door opened, and a tall man with short-cropped black hair entered, closing the door behind him. He wore a stone-gray suit that he filled out in a muscular way. He smiled at me with perfect, straight white teeth, and the lights made his pale green eyes sparkle in a way that made them look endlessly deep. He was handsome in an ordinary way, his skin tan and blemish-free. He was clean-shaven and gave off a friendly aura. But if you put him in a crowd, he would disappear in obscurity. I extended my hand with my best interview smile and introduced myself. "David Morgan, pleasure to meet you." He took my hand in a firm grasp and shook it gently. "Pleasure," he replied in a deep but soft voice that almost rolled past the ear without being heard. He sat and glanced at the empty mugs on the small glass table between the chairs. He pointed to them and asked, "Do you have any coffee, David?" Yes, of course. "Allow me," I said as I scrambled to pick up the mugs. "A spoon each of cream and sugar if you would," he requested. "Fine taste in coffee, sir," I replied as I filled the mugs. I sat down across from him and proffered the mug, which he took with a smile. I turned on the recorder and picked up my notepad. David Morgan. Date December 17th, 2023. Today we have the pleasure of interviewing. I paused. "I'm sorry, I never asked your name. What should I call you?" His smile grew wider as he held up 10 fingers and then put a pinky down. "I have gone by so many names over the years," he began. "The Immortal, the Watcher, Father Time, John, the Guide. These days I go by Eternity. It's got a nice flair to it, don't you think?" I took a few notes in my pad and smiled at him. "It's unique for sure." I picked up a folder and took out the first of many papers. "It says here in our notes that you claim to have been alive forever." "Yes, that is why I've come here today. I'd like to tell the world," Eternity said, gesturing with his hands dramatically. "All right, Eternity. Can you tell me about where and when you were born?" He laughed a deep belly laugh that seemed to almost force a grin on my face before I started to chuckle softly along with him. "Well," he said, catching his breath, holding up 9 fingers and dropping them down to 8. "I remember floating in a black nothingness, and that lasted for a very long time. I faded in and out of consciousness during this time with nothing to see or do but grow and sleep. But then there was a bright flash, and I was here. In a body that could be described as a toddler, I began to explore this bright and chaotic primal world." "So you were born before the creation of our world?" I said, scribbling in my notepad. "Is that a question?" Eternity asked, raising 8 fingers. "More like a statement of confirmation," I replied. He lowered his hands. "Fair enough, yes, as far as I can tell, I came into being before Earth." "So you started exploring the new world," I prompted. "Oh, ho, ho, clever wording," he said, wagging a finger. I wandered and watched. It wasn't much better than the blackness. Sure, there was more to look at, but even among the primal chaos of a virgin planet, it felt empty and quickly began to bore me. Once I grew tired of my new surroundings, I laid down to sleep again. I can't tell you how long I slept, but when I woke again, I had grown to the size you'd call late teens. The chaos had settled, so I began a new lap around the world to see what had changed. It didn't take long to come across small, slimy creatures with 4 legs and tails crawling around. I got down on all 4s like them and began to follow them around. I saw them eat and drink and thought to try it myself. Food has gotten much better since then. I watched them for a while, but they didn't do much, so when I grew bored, I took a trip around the world and found a cozy place to sleep once more. He took a large drink of his coffee and took out a cigar. "Do you mind?" he asked, gesturing at it with a lighter. "Feel free," I replied, taking a drink myself and taking out a cigarette. "But I think you get the picture. Next time I woke, dinosaurs were roaming, and they were fun to watch. Until they weren't. I was sleeping by the time the meteor came down. That was quite the wake-up call." "That sounds pretty exciting," I added. "I had just woken up and I don't remember much when I first wake up, you know." I nodded so as not to interrupt. But there was fire and smoke and dust. The screams of dying things were everywhere. Then everything was dark again. I don't like the dark, so I curled up and went to sleep again. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," I said. "It was a long, long time ago," he replied. "Next up was primitive man, the Ice Age, and so forth until now." "So what is your goal exactly?" I asked. "Just to watch, I suppose. I just wander around to see what's going on," he spoke while holding up 8 fingers and lowering one. I took a dozen different photos out of the folder. Each of them were of him shaking hands with presidents, prime ministers, religious leaders, and heads of other countries, and spread them out on the table. "I see you have a habit of meeting world leaders and people in places of power," I said. "Yes, and?" he said with a sly grin. I paused for a second, choosing my words. "That's an interesting hobby," I said with my own smile. Eternity laughed that infectious laugh again, and I laughed along with him. "Yes, David, good job," he said. "I do find it interesting to meet the people you choose to put in charge, not for any nefarious reasons, just to see what they're like." "If you live forever, why not interfere?" I asked, and winced when he raised 7 fingers and they lowered to 6. But I still had 6 questions left. "Politics bore me, and I don't want to rule. That would ruin the game. Plus, it wouldn't be fair to you guys who age and die." "There is a maximum 8-year rule for the position of president," I replied. "It would come out quickly that I don't age if I put myself in the spotlight. I'm sure a lot of people would be thrilled to have an immortal president, and even more would lock me up and experiment on me. I suppose that brings me to this. Why reveal yourself now? 6 fingers down to 5. I'm bored again, David. I've watched civilization rise and fall hundreds of times. You've peaked and reached the pinnacle of scientific and technological advancement, only to destroy yourselves in apocalyptic shows of force. But life is persistent, and the fish always scrawls out of the pond, and here we are again. An echo of an echo, slightly different, but ultimately the same. One thing I haven't done in all these ages, though, is reveal myself. So let's see how it goes. I'm honored to be the one to kick off your entertainment, I said. As you should be, he said, holding up 5 fingers. I dabbed at the sweat starting to build on my forehead, and not wanting to lose his interest, I asked, "Do you know how or why you live forever?" I've contemplated the why a lot, and the only answer I've come to is to watch, to see everything this planet has to offer. As or the how, this was just the way I was born. 4 fingers. Are you God then? I asked. Oh no, I'm no God. Capital G or lower. I didn't create anything. I didn't even put myself here, I just woke up here. He held up 3 fingers and wiggled them around. What sort of powers do you have then? He lowered one of the wiggling fingers, 2 left. I wouldn't call them powers, really. I don't need food or water, but I can consume them. I can sleep for a very long time, or not sleep for a very long time. Small wounds heal very fast. Bigger ones take longer, but not as long as you. I was only sick once, in 1347 in Europe. A rat bit me, but I recovered quickly. Can you die? 1 dancing finger left. That's a rather dark question, don't you think? Just a curiosity. I'll leave it out if you want, for another finger. Nah, I'll answer it, because I don't know. I'm still alive, aren't I? I've been hurt plenty, but none so serious it could kill me. I haven't pushed it either. Pain isn't very fun. Fair enough. All right, last question then. What are your plans moving forward? Well, David, like I said, I'm bored. Pain isn't fun, but at least it's something new. I'm going to find the answer to your last question. He lowered his last finger and finished his mug of coffee before standing up. I stood with him and extended a hand. Well, it's been interesting eternity and a pleasure to interview you. He shook it with a grin and said, I look forward to reading it, and swaggered out the door. When the door clicked shut, I spoke into my earpiece. He's on his way out. Now's the time. There were the sounds of a scuffle on the other side of the door as the masked men subdued and tied up the immortal man and took him to their van out back. A man in a black suit, short gray hair, sharp features mostly hidden behind large black sunglasses, and a gun at his hip. He approached me, handed me a large white envelope, and said gruffly, Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Morgan. I suspect that will help you forget this ever happened. He walked out, taking my interview notes with him and leaving the door open to reveal a spotless waiting room. No sign of the abduction that just took place. I sat back down in the uncomfortable leather chair, lit another cigarette, and started counting the money in the envelope. My classmates disappeared for an hour. I went to a really shitty middle school. The building itself was made in the 1920s. It had 5 main buildings: cafeteria, main hall, music, fine arts, mechanicals, and the gym. Each building was connected by these poorly built metal roofs so that you could walk between buildings and not get rained on. But it also meant that you could see if people were walking between classes. Teachers would be able to see if a kid was lingering outside and not going to class. I was in 8th grade in my science classroom when we all heard and felt an explosion. Sandy Hook had just happened a few months before, so everyone was on edge. The principal came onto the intercom and said the code phrase that meant everyone was to evacuate the building. Context for non-Americans. After the series of school shootings, some public schools decided to have code phrases that would mean different things instead of saying, "Hey, there's a shooter up in here." They'd say something like Eagle's Nest or Cooper's Field, something like that. There were multiple phrases, and they each meant something different. The only ones I remember were evacuate, hide, and then the code was the drill. You could only return inside the building when the appropriate phrase was said again, this time meaning the coast was clear. Our principal said the evacuate code word, and although we had practiced it, all hell broke loose. It was every man for himself. People were pushing each other, and the teachers were trying to have some control. But it didn't work. Students started being trampled, and they were screaming. My friend Katie pulled us into the girls' restroom, and we decided to hide here until the crowd had calmed down. The fire alarm went off. You couldn't hear the screams of the students over it. Then the sprinklers came on as well. Katie and I were soaked. After a few minutes, we both went out into the hall, the alarm still blaring and water everywhere. It was as if nothing had happened. The hallways were clear. No signs of the previous chaos at all. We didn't really care that much, so we ran out the back doors into the designated safety area, a park in a neighborhood just across from the school. But as we go closer, we could see no one was there. We both assumed we got the location wrong, even though they had drilled it into us since the beginning of the year. But we had a big school, so we had multiple safety areas. We went to the next one, the parking lot by the football field. We walked around the entire school to get there, and we saw no one. Not one single person. The alarms were still going, but everything looked as if nothing had happened. There were still cars in the parking lot, so we knew that teachers hadn't left, but we couldn't see anyone. A feeling of vertigo set over me, and I threw up on the football field. Katie rubbed my back and said she would call her mom. I didn't have a phone yet, and Katie had those ladybug phones that could only call her mom and the police. Katie's mom picked up and she cried, telling her what happened. Katie's mom said she would call my parents and then come pick us up. She told us to stay where we were and that she would be there soon. About 30 minutes pass. I'm not exactly sure on the time, but definitely should not have taken Katie's mom that long to get to us. Katie called again, but this time her mom didn't pick up. She tried again and again, but still nothing. We talked about calling the police, but we didn't know if we'd get in trouble. If something was really wrong, then the police would have already been here, we had figured. And looking back, yeah, we really should have just called the police. But we had this weird idea that we would be in trouble. So we stayed put and waiting again for Katie's mom. At about the hour mark, the fire alarm turned off. The period bell rang, and a few seconds later, students came walking out of the buildings, casually heading to their next classes, like nothing was wrong. We were closest to the gym building, and my brother had that period. I called out to him, and he came running over along with the coach. They were completely dry, like they hadn't been around the sprinklers. Both Katie and I were crying, asking what had happened. They didn't answer, and they took us to the nurse, who then called our parents. I kept asking the nurse what happened. There was a boom, and we were told to evacuate. She said that there was a simple science experiment gone wrong in one of the other science classrooms. They wanted to make sure there wasn't a chemical leak or anything, so they evacuated the school. She told us that she understands why we would be scared, but that we should have gone to the designated safety area, the park in the neighborhood across the street. We told we did, over and over again. But she just tried to calm us down. But I could tell she didn't believe us. My parents came to pick me up first. I asked them if Katie's mom had called them to tell them what happened. They said Katie's mom never called them. I told my parents what happened, and I don't think they thought I was lying. I had never lied about anything before. But they definitely didn't believe me. Katie stayed home from school for the rest of the week. I got my parents' permission to use our home phone to call Katie. I asked her if she was okay, and if her mom was okay, since she never came to get us. She told me that her mom never got a call from her. Katie's mom had come to the school when the school called. Katie was angry at her mom, saying that she said she was on her way. Katie's mom was confused, telling her that she never got a call from her. Katie didn't believe her, and she had to show Katie her call history to prove that she never got a call. Katie's phone showed the call logs, but Katie's mom did not. We didn't talk about it. We never had a discussion or anything, but neither Katie or I ever talked about it again. not publicly. The memory faded into my mind. I'd like to believe that it was a dream, or maybe that shared delusion thing, or just that Katie and I made it up for attention. Because those things I could accept. But there are times when I remember how loud the fire alarm was, how scared I was when I saw no one in the safety area, and the vertigo feeling that made me feel like I was dying. I don't know what happened, but I have never felt the same way again as I did in that 1 hour. Missing. I sat in the living room, gently swirling my mid-afternoon coffee around in my mug. It was a chilly Friday in February, and I had managed to complete enough of my workload to allow myself the rest of the day off, a rare treat. I decided to indulge in my favorite sitcom before everyone returned from school and work, and began digging around the couch for the remote to no avail. I sighed and began rooting through all the clutter on the coffee table in hopes of finding it there. During my search, my fingers brushed over a picture nestled under a fishing magazine. I picked it up. It was a picture of my late ex-husband, Mike, and our daughter Yasmin, out on one of their camping adventures. I released a bittersweet smile. Mike and I had split up when Yasmin was just 2 due to his workaholic nature. It was a rough divorce, but once the dust settled, we co-parented very well. We had split custody of Yasmin, although she'd always been a daddy's girl and always favored staying at his house so they could have outdoor adventures. Mike sadly passed away 4 years ago when Yasmin was 10, due to a lengthy battle with his mental health, which was worsened by the loss of both his parents in a short time span. Yasmin was distraught, and after years of therapy, she seemed to be doing better in herself. 2 years ago, we moved in with my now husband, Kenny. Kenny had a beautiful home and welcomed us with open arms. He has 2 kids from his previous girlfriend who decided parenting was not for her and abruptly moved to another country while the kids were very young. Kenny's 2 kids were non-identical twins, Jake and Holly, who are 9. Jake and Holly are both pretty well behaved for their age, and I've made an effort to make them feel comfortable having me around. Holly loves our days out getting milkshakes, and Jake enjoys our time spent kicking a ball around in the garden. They both enjoy watching wrestling, so normally the 3 of us will put it on the TV and discuss how our day went while waiting for Kenny to get home. Yasmin, however, remains distant to us all. She's openly voiced her dislike for Kenny, calling him horrible and evil. Kenny overall is a very good man, but he is quite short-tempered. He'll often snap if his limits are pushed. I've told my daughter to simply not push his buttons and he won't tell her off. Yasmin will then bluntly remind me that he's not her parent and isolate herself in her room. A year ago, we brought a family dog in hopes to help everyone bond. He was a small Chihuahua named Yappy. Sadly, Yappy escaped through our front door 6 months later, and the outcome was not good. Being the last one home, Kenny was sure he shut the front door upon his arrival, but concluded he must have forgotten. Kenny felt awful and his kids were devastated. Yasmin was unbothered. I downed the last of my now lukewarm coffee and slid the photograph into a drawer in the coffee table. I plucked the remote from under a half-eaten bag of sweets and began my sitcom binge. 3:30 ticked around, and the front door opened. Jake and Holly entered, dumping their school bags in the hallway and running to join me in the living room. "Hey, you 2, how was school?" I asked them. "It was A," Jake replied. "Can we watch wrestling?" I nod my head, turning off my sitcom and replacing it with their favorite show. The intro sounded, and the camera panned over the wrestlers. "Look, Holly exclaimed. "It's the Mushroom Man versus Bloodthirst tonight." "Go, Bloodthirst!" I yelled as Jake and Holly perched on the sofa next to me. In all the excitement, I forgot to keep an eye on the time. The front door opened once more, and in walked Kenny. He kicked his shoes off in the hallway before joining us in the living room. "Who's winning?" he asked, squeezing himself onto the crowded couch. "Mushroom Man," Jake told him without taking his eyes off the screen. "You're home early. How was work?" I asked my husband. "I'm only half an hour early," chuckled Kenny. "Boss let us all leave early because we're so good at our jobs. That, and he had an emergency maintenance issue at home." I laughed and began to pull myself off the couch. "Right, I guess I'd best start making dinner." Kenny stood up. "No need, I'll cook tonight. It's my turn to be the chef." And with that, he disappeared into the kitchen. I pulled out my phone to send Yasmin a text. It certainly wasn't uncommon for her to come back later, as she'd often be hanging out with friends, but I wanted to make sure she'd be back for dinner. An hour went by, and I got no response. I sent another text. "Dinner?" Kenny called. We all got up and headed for the kitchen. Kenny had made a lovely lasagna with a medley of vegetables on the side. As we were loading our plates with piping hot lasagna, the front door opened. It was Yasmin. "Where have you been? Why didn't you reply to my texts? I was worried," I told her. Yasmin shrugged. "I was with friends. I couldn't reply." I sighed. "Well, come and get a plate." Yasmin slunk into the kitchen and piled on a small helping before turning towards the door. "Where are you going?" I asked her. "My room." "Yas, no. We're eating together down here today. Come on." I motioned towards the dining room table. "No, thanks," Yasmin replied sarcastically. "I don't like anyone here. I'll just eat upstairs." "No, your mother said you're eating down here. Now have a seat." Kenny interjected firmly. Yasmin scoffed. "Nobody was talking to you. I am my own person and I want to eat by myself." "Don't be rude. You can join us for once rather than always avoiding us like we're ogres," I insisted. "I said I don't want to. You and your little fake family can eat together, but count me out." "Yasmin, don't be so rude," I told her. "Kenny has put a lot of effort into dinner, and you can at least sit down with us to eat." "Shame you didn't put as much effort into your last marriage as he did with his dinner. Maybe then I'd be living with my dad and not a bitch in her asshole husband's family." "Right, that's it." Kenny got up from the table and walked over to Yasmin, snatching the plate from her hands and dumping the contents into the bin. "Now go away. I'm not dealing with your bullshit. We want to eat in peace." He rejoined his kids at the table, not looking back up at Yasmin. Yasmin let out a shocked laugh before slamming the door. I swallowed the lump in my throat before joining everyone at the table. Kenny shook his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. "She's just a teenager, Ken. It's all new to her. She's had a really rough time with—" "Here come the excuses," Kenny interrupted. "I've got all the sympathy in the world for what she went through, but you can't keep just coddling her. That girl's got too much attitude to talk like that in my damn house." Dinner went on in silence. After we'd finished, I proceeded to load the dishwasher. Holly began washing up the non-dishwasher-friendly utensils, while Jake grabbed a tea towel and started drying. Kenny loaded up a plate with lasagna and began to walk to the door. I knew exactly where he was going, and I couldn't help but smile. As I said, although grumpy, he was a kind soul. Once the kitchen was clean and everything was put away, We returned to the living room for what we called family film night. Rather than rotating who picks the movie, which led to a loud dispute last time, we use a random movie picker on our tablet to choose what we watch that week. Today, the app picked us The Time Traveler, which looked like a sort of sci-fi thriller. Holly went off to grab popcorn and drinks for our makeshift cinema, while Jake began the download. About 10 minutes later, Kenny returned and sat next to me on the couch. "How did it go?" I asked softly. Kenny smiled. "We're going fishing tomorrow." I was bewildered. "How did you pull that off?" "I told you I'm the best." Kenny chuckled, putting his arm around me. "That, and I said I'd give her a tenner." I rolled my eyes. "The reliable method of bribery." I sighed. "Won't she need a fishing license?" "It'll be all right. My usual spot is very secluded. Nobody will catch us out, and if they do, she's under 12. Kenny woke up early the next morning and made everyone pancakes. I stumbled around the kitchen, still half asleep. "You'll have to go wake her up soon," Kenny told me. "I want to get going once I've loaded up the car." Yasmin put up her usual battle to refrain from coming to life, but eventually relented. While she was getting ready, I chucked on my jogging bottoms and jumper and helped Kenny load up the car. "Really lucked out with weather today," my husband beamed. As he finished carefully sliding his fishing rods into the boot, he cursed. "Damn it, I left my tackle box in the shed." He then quickly paced back to the back garden while I continued to pack the car. I moved Kenny's thick winter jacket out of the way to make room when suddenly something slipped out the boot. I looked down to be met with a large hunting knife with a panther carved into the handle. "He must need it for fishing," I thought to myself. "I hope he doesn't get caught with it. That's certainly not legal to carry." Kenny soon reappeared, tackle box in hand. I soon bid farewell to my husband and daughter before heading back inside, pondering what to do with my day. I decided to get caught up with some projects at work and sent my mother-in-law a text asking if she could have her grandchildren for the day. My mother-in-law replied within 5 minutes with a very positive yes. Jake and Holly, who had just finished their breakfast, looked up at me as I entered. "All right, get changed. We're off to see your grandma." 4 o'clock came around, and I drove the half hour to my mother-in-law's to pick up Jake and Holly. "Any time, please come in for tea." We got home at around 6. Jake and Holly immediately headed for their rooms. I resumed my spot on the couch. I picked up my mobile phone, which I'd accidentally left on the couch all day. 4 missed calls from Kenny. I panic and call him. No response. As I'm pacing the living room wondering what could be wrong, Kenny's car pulls into the driveway. I ran out to meet him. "Why the fuck didn't you answer your phone?" he yelled. "I left it on the couch on silent all day. Are you okay? Where's Yasmin?" Kenny looked pale. "She disappeared. I looked everywhere. I couldn't get any phone service at the river, so tried to call you during the 40-minute drive home. Call the police." Within what felt like seconds, I'd called the police and we were all in the car heading to the river, dropping Jake and Holly back to their grandmother's in the way. "What actually happened, Kenny? What happened?" I asked him frantically. Kenny gripped the steering wheel. "We got to the river at noon. I unloaded the car and we walked the 20 minutes to my fishing spot. We get set up, get our chairs set, bait our lines, and have some sodas while chatting. About 2 hours in, Yasmin says she needs the toilet. I tell her to go ahead and go behind a tree. She gets up and walks off. Sounded like she walked off quite far, but I assumed she wanted more privacy. Then 5 minutes go by, and I call out asking if everything's okay. No response. I stand up and start walking to where it sounded like she went, still calling out and making my presence known. 10 minutes go by, then 20. And by this point, I'm running about everywhere, frantically shouting out, but she was just gone. Kenny took a deep breath, swallowing hard. There were no other cars around when we parked. There was no sign of anyone else around for miles. I didn't reply. I just stared straight ahead in silence. The police met us at the scene. Kenny repeated what he'd told me and led the officers to the fishing spot. We all searched the woods for hours until the police told us to return home and rest. I protested, saying my daughter is out in the cold somewhere, but they insisted. We drove in silence the entire 40 minutes home. Neither of us slept. Thankfully, my mother-in-law was more than happy to let Jake and Holly stay for a few days while we continued looking for my daughter. It was Sunday at 2:17 p.m. that we received the call. Yasmin's body had been found washed up on a bank a mile down the river. Kenny sobbed. I was numb. Upon arriving back at the scene, an officer took us aside. "Tell me what happened, please. Just tell me. I can take it." I stuttered my words out. The officer gave me a sympathetic look before telling me Yasmin's throat was cut and her body thrown into the river. "We've identified this as the murder weapon. It was found within a puncture wound in her body where she washed up," the officer said, pulling out an evidence bag containing a hunting knife with a panther carved into the handle. I looked at Kenny. His face was ashen, and his mouth hung open. But he couldn't get the words out. It's been 6 months since my daughter's death. After the discovery, myself, Jake, and Holly were all taken in for questioning. We all said Kenny and Yasmin had a very strained relationship. We recounted all the times things would blow up, including our dinner that night. With all the evidence, Kenny was found guilty and wept as he was taken away from everyone. My ex-husband Kenny is currently in prison. I don't know what happened to his kids. Maybe custody was given to their grandma or another family member, or maybe they're in the system. I don't know anymore. What I do know is now I get a fresh start, even more free than I was before. You see, Mike was easy to get rid of. It was infuriating to watch someone who had little time for me have all the time in the world for our daughter. I grew resentment. His already receding mental health was easy to push over the edge with some anonymous letters and fake social media accounts bullying him for the loss of his parents. All that was left was to constantly keep him from seeing Yasmin, and he was gone. It quickly became apparent that Yasmin was going to be a pain in the ass and try to sabotage every future relationship I had by being insufferable to everyone. She just had to go. Kenny's hunting knife, tucked into my pajama trousers and hidden under my robe, was the perfect hiding spot. I'm so grateful my ex-mother-in-law took in his kids that day, so I could finish my little project. She was a huge help. I don't know what will happen to Kenny. I sold his house after the divorce and moved away, but through the grapevine I've heard he's not coping well in his cell, but we'll see how that plays out. And as for Yappy, well, he was just a nuisance. Simply sneaking to the front door after Kenny got home from a long day and went straight to the shower was easy. He still carries that burden in his heart, but I'm sure his mind is full of other things these days. My name is Yvonne Slater, and I'm ready for a fresh start.